I woke that morning with the peculiar lightness that comes with milestone birthdays, the kind of anticipation that makes you smooth the silk nightgown against your skin just a little longer before rising, savoring the promise of celebration that hangs in the air like expensive perfume. 60 years old today, and Douglas had been so mysteriously secretive about the plans, whispering into his phone in corners of the house, shooing me away from the sunroom where I usually took my morning coffee with an almost boyish grin that reminded me, for just a moment, of the man I'd fallen in love with 35 years ago. The morning light filtered through the custom Italian blinds I'd selected for our master suite, casting geometric patterns across the cream carpet that had cost more than most people's cars, and I allowed myself the luxury of believing that perhaps finally, Douglas was going to surprise me with something that showed he still saw me as more than the elegant accessory I'd become over the decades. Perhaps he'd remembered how I used to love intimate gatherings, how I'd once been the kind of woman who could transform a simple dinner party into an evening that guests would reminisce about for years to come, back when I still believed my opinions on wine pairings and seating arrangements mattered to anyone beyond the catering staff. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I selected my outfit with the care of a general choosing armor for battle, though I didn't yet know I was heading into war. The Armani dress in sage green that Douglas had complimented exactly once, paired with the pearls his mother had given me for our 10th anniversary, a peace offering after years of barely concealed disdain, though I'd later learned she'd charged them to Douglas's account and claimed credit for the gesture. My reflection in the full-length mirror showed a woman who'd maintained herself well, who understood the art of understated elegance that separated old money from new, who could still turn heads at the country club though the heads belonged increasingly to men Douglas's age rather than younger admirers. The first sign that something was amiss came when I descended the curved staircase to find our housekeeper Maria, avoiding my eyes as she arranged white orchids, Douglas's favorite, not mine, in crystal vases throughout the foyer. Maria had been with us for 15 years, had watched me comfort Douglas through his father's death, had seen me nurse him through pneumonia winters ago, had witnessed countless moments of what I'd believed was genuine affection between us. Yet today, she couldn't meet my gaze, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she adjusted stems that were already perfectly positioned. "Mrs. Monroe," she said softly, her accent thickening the way it always did when she was nervous. "Perhaps you would like coffee in your office this morning? The sunroom is being prepared for your guests." My office, the small, elegant space at the back of the house where I managed our charitable foundations, wrote thank you notes in my practice script, and maintained the social calendar that kept Douglas's political and business connections properly cultivated. The room where I'd spent countless hours organizing fundraisers that enhanced his reputation, where I'd drafted speeches he'd delivered to standing ovations, where I'd researched his opponent's weaknesses during his mayoral campaigns, all while he took credit for his natural political instincts and intuitive understanding of public sentiment. I should have known then, should have recognized the careful choreography of my own betrayal being arranged around me like flowers in a funeral parlor. Instead, I smiled at Maria with the warmth that had made me genuinely beloved by our staff over the years, touched her shoulder gently and said, "That's thoughtful, but I think I'll peek at the preparations. I can't resist seeing how beautiful everything looks." The sunroom had been transformed into something that would have photographed beautifully for Architectural Digest, all white linens and gold accents, with those ridiculously expensive orchids creating an atmosphere of sophisticated celebration. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see our manicured grounds stretching toward the infinity pool and the tennis court Douglas had installed 5 years ago but used exactly twice, preferring to conduct his exercise regimen at the exclusive club where he could be seen by the right people. The guest list, I noticed, was smaller than I'd expected. Not the intimate gathering of our closest friends I'd anticipated, but not the grand social affair Douglas usually preferred for occasions that might generate publicity. Instead, it seemed carefully curated to include specific witnesses, his business partners, a few social acquaintances whose opinions carried weight in our circles, and my heart sank slightly. That woman, Celeste Ambers, arrived precisely at noon, fashionably punctual in the way that betrayed her middle-class origins despite the designer everything she wore like armor against her own insecurities. At 32, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that required tremendous effort to maintain, the sort of Instagram-ready perfection that looked slightly artificial in person, as if she existed in a perpetual soft focus filter. I'd met her twice before at charity functions, where she'd photographed herself extensively while donating minimally, and each time I'd been struck by the calculating intelligence behind her wide, allegedly innocent eyes. She kissed the air beside my cheeks with practiced precision, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume and barely concealed ambition. "Evelyn," she gushed, her voice pitched at the perfect register of warmth that fooled absolutely no one who understood the social dynamics at play, "you look absolutely radiant. 60 is just a number when you're as graceful as you are." The backhanded compliment landed exactly as intended, a subtle reminder that she was acknowledging my age while positioning herself as the generous younger woman offering praise to her elder. I smiled with the serene graciousness I'd perfected over decades of navigating far more sophisticated opponents than Celeste Amber's, and replied, "How kind of you to say, dear. That dress is stunning on you." Versace knows exactly how to flatter a woman who understands her advantages. It was a perfectly calibrated response that could be interpreted as either genuine admiration or subtle warfare, depending on one's level of social sophistication. Celeste's smile faltered for just a moment, uncertainty flickering across her features as she tried to decode whether she'd been complimented or insulted, before she recovered with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. Douglas appeared then, moving through the room with the confident stride that had served him well in politics and business, pausing to shake hands and exchange pleasantries with our guests, while somehow managing to position himself always within Celeste's orbit. He looked distinguished in his navy suit, the silver at his temples perfectly styled, his smile warm and genuine in a way that made me remember why I'd once believed he loved me as much as I loved him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising a glass of champagne that caught the afternoon light like liquid gold, "thank you all for joining us today to celebrate a very special birthday. Evelyn has been the most devoted wife any man could ask for, and I wanted to share this milestone with the people who matter most to both of us." The words were perfect, exactly what anyone would expect to hear at such an occasion, but there was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of my neck rise with primal warning. He was performing, hitting his marks like an actor who'd rehearsed this scene until every gesture appeared spontaneous, and suddenly I understood that I wasn't the guest of honor at this gathering. I was the main attraction in some elaborate production I didn't yet comprehend. "Evelyn," he continued, his voice carrying that particular cadence he used when making important pronouncements, "has always been a woman who values clarity and honesty above all else. She's taught me that the most loving thing we can do for someone is to be completely truthful, even when that truth is difficult to hear." The envelope appeared in his hand as if conjured by a magician, cream-colored paper that was expensive enough to convey respect while delivering devastating news. I recognized the letterhead of his attorney's office, the same firm that had handled our estate planning, our real estate transactions, all the legal documents that had bound our lives together in what I'd believed was permanent partnership. "So, in the spirit of that honesty," Douglas said, his voice gentle and regretful in the way that made his cruelty seem almost compassionate, "I think it's time we both embrace a new chapter in our lives." The silence that followed was the kind that accompanies car accidents and natural disasters, that moment when the mind struggles to process information that doesn't align with reality. I felt every eye in the room fixed on me, measuring my reaction, cataloging my expression for later dissection and discussion. The society photographer Douglas had hired ostensibly to capture my birthday celebration adjusted her camera angle to better frame what was clearly the money shot she'd been hired to document. I took the envelope with hands that remained perfectly steady, opened it with the careful precision I'd learned from years of handling documents that required discreet review, and read the first few lines of text that dissolved 35 years of marriage into legal terminology and financial calculations. The words blurred slightly, not from tears I was far too controlled for such public display but from the sheer magnitude of betrayal condensed into courier font and formal language. "Douglas," I said finally, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with the clarity that comes from shock-induced composure, "this is quite a surprise." It was masterfully understated. The kind of response that would be quoted in social circles for months to come, either as evidence of my dignity under pressure or my complete inability to comprehend what was happening to me. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them into my purse, the same Kelly bag I'd carried to countless similar gatherings where I'd played the supporting role in Douglas's various performances. "I hope you'll understand," he said, and there was almost genuine regret in his voice, as if he truly believed he was being kind by humiliating me publicly rather than privately, that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is acknowledge when we've grown in different directions. Celeste moved closer to him then, not quite touching but positioning herself within what body language experts would recognize as intimate space, and I realized that this entire gathering had been orchestrated. Not just to end our marriage but to establish her as my replacement in the most public way possible. She was staking her claim to my position, my home, my carefully curated life, with an audience of witnesses who would carry the story to every important social circle in the city. The champagne in my glass had gone flat, bubbles dying one by one, like tiny hopes dissolving into nothing. But I raised it anyway, and smiled with the grace that had served me through countless difficult social situations. "Well then," I said, my voice carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine while revealing nothing of the cold fury beginning to crystallize in my chest, "I suppose the best gift you could give me on my 60th birthday is clarity about where I stand." I finished the champagne in one long sip, set the glass down on the marble side table with deliberate precision, and walked through the room saying goodbye to each guest with the kind of personal attention that reminded them why they'd always preferred me to Douglas at social functions. I kissed cheeks, squeezed hands, made eye contact that conveyed both gratitude for their presence and absolute composure in the face of public humiliation. "Thank you all for being here," I said, as I reached the sunroom's entrance, pausing to look back at the beautiful space I'd designed, at the guests whose respect I'd cultivated over decades, at my husband and his replacement who were watching me with the fascination reserved for car accidents and reality television. It's been illuminating. And then I walked out of my own birthday party, my head high and my spine straight, leaving behind the sounds of rapidly igniting gossip and speculation. I didn't look back, didn't pause for dramatic effect, didn't give them the satisfaction of witnessing my breakdown. Instead, I walked to my car, the Mercedes Douglas had given me for our 25th anniversary, back when he still occasionally remembered that grand gestures were part of maintaining the fiction of our happiness, and drove away from the estate. That had been my prison disguised as paradise, but I didn't drive home to some lonely apartment or friend's guest room to lick my wounds and plan my surrender. Instead, I drove toward the future I'd been quietly preparing for years, toward the reckoning that Douglas Monroe had just made inevitable. Harry's bungalow had always been my sanctuary from the suffocating perfection of the Monroe estate, a place where mismatched antique furniture coexisted with modern art, where books were stacked in towering piles that threatened structural integrity, where the garden grew wild and beautiful in defiance of every principle of landscape architecture I'd ever learned. Harriet Vasquez had retired from her law practice 5 years ago after 3 decades of making powerful men very uncomfortable in divorce court, but she'd retained the sharp intelligence and protective instincts that had made her legendary among women seeking justice from husbands who'd underestimated them. I found her in the kitchen, naturally, grinding coffee beans with the kind of vintage machine that produced perfect espresso while requiring actual skill to operate, her silver hair twisted into the messy bun that had been her signature style since law school, wearing the kind of flowing kaftan that looked ridiculous on most women, but made Harry appear like some sort of bohemian goddess of righteous vengeance. "Well," she said without looking up from the espresso machine, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from 40 years of courtroom advocacy and the occasional cigarette she still indulged in when the occasion demanded celebration or commiseration. "I assume from your unexpected arrival and the particular set of your shoulders that Douglas has finally shown his true colors." It was typical Harry, cutting straight through social pleasantries to the heart of the matter with the precision that had made opposing counsel dread her presence in mediation. She'd been warning me for years that Douglas was the kind of man who would eventually prioritize his own comfort over any loyalty to the woman who'd helped build his success. But she'd done it with the delicacy of a friend who understands that some lessons can only be learned through experience. He served me divorce papers at what I thought was my birthday brunch, I said, settling into the worn leather chair that had been my designated spot for countless afternoons of conversation over the past 2 decades. In front of witnesses, including his replacement, Harry's hand paused for just a moment on the espresso machine's lever, the only sign that she was processing the calculated cruelty of Douglas's approach, before she continued preparing our coffee with the methodical precision that had always calmed my nerves. Replacement, she repeated, her tone suggesting she was filing the information away for future strategic use. Let me guess, younger, beautiful, and thoroughly convinced she's the first woman to ever truly understand him. Celeste Ambers, 32. Instagram lifestyle influencer, approximately half my intelligence and twice my ambition. I accepted the perfect cup of espresso Harry handed me, inhaling the rich aroma that always reminded me of the year we'd spent traveling through Italy together after her second divorce, back when I still believed travel meant freedom rather than simply more elegant locations for feeling trapped. Ah, Harry said, settling into her own chair with the satisfied expression of a chess master who'd anticipated her opponent's opening move, the classic midlife crisis upgrade. He trades in the accomplished wife who knows where all the bodies are buried, for the shiny new model who thinks his success is natural rather than carefully orchestrated. She was right, of course. Douglas had always been drawn to women who reflected his image of himself as naturally superior rather than those who understood exactly how much work went into maintaining that illusion. During our marriage, I'd gradually learned to hide my contributions to his success, to make my intelligence available while keeping it invisible, to be the perfect wife who enhanced his reputation without threatening his ego. The thing is, Harry, I said, setting down my cup with the careful precision that had become second nature after decades of never allowing myself to appear less than perfectly composed, I've been expecting this for quite some time. Her eyebrows rose with the interest of a woman who'd spent her career helping other women navigate the treacherous waters of dissolving marriages, and I saw the exact moment when she shifted from sympathetic friend to strategic advisor. Define expecting, she said, leaning forward with the focused attention that had made her one of the most successful divorce attorneys in the state. Do you remember 5 years ago when Douglas started that offshore consulting firm? The one that was supposedly helping international clients with real estate investments. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure folder where I'd been quietly documenting what I'd discovered. It turns out that several of those clients exist only on paper, and the real estate investments are surprisingly similar to properties Douglas has been acquiring through shell companies. Harry's expression shifted from interest to professional appreciation as she realized the implications of what I was telling her. You've been tracking his money, she said, and there was something like pride in her voice. For how long? Since James graduated from college and Douglas started talking about restructuring our financial portfolio for tax efficiency, I replied, remembering the patronizing tone he'd used when explaining why we needed to move assets into entities I supposedly wouldn't understand. He assumed I was too focused on charity work and social obligations to pay attention to the details of our finances. The truth was more complicated, of course. I'd always been involved in managing our investments, but Douglas had gradually marginalized my role while taking credit for the successful strategies we'd developed together. When he'd started making significant financial moves without consulting me, I'd initially been hurt by the exclusion. It had taken me months to realize that the exclusion was intentional, that he was systematically moving assets beyond my reach in preparation for exactly the scene that had played out today. Show me, Harry said, and her voice carried the authority that had once made multi-million-dollar settlements seem reasonable to men who'd entered negotiations determined to give their wives nothing but heartache. I opened the secure folder and handed her my phone, watching her face as she scrolled through months of carefully documented transfers, shell company filings, and property acquisitions. She was speed reading with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades analyzing complex financial arrangements, occasionally pausing to screenshot particular documents or make notes in the margin of her legal pad. Evelyn, she said finally, looking up from my phone with an expression that mixed admiration with something approaching awe. You've essentially conducted your own forensic accounting investigation. This is the kind of documentation that takes private investigators months to compile, and you've been doing it while maintaining the fiction of being the oblivious society wife. I had excellent motivation, I replied, and for the first time, Since leaving the estate, I felt the cold smile that would become my signature expression over the coming weeks. Douglas has always underestimated women, particularly women he considers intellectually inferior. It never occurred to him that the wife who needed his guidance with complex financial matters might be perfectly capable of understanding exactly what he was doing. Harry set down my phone and reached for her own legal pad, the one she'd used during her most complex cases, and I knew that my friend was transitioning into the role that had made her legendary. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency that had once struck fear into the hearts of men who thought they could outsmart her in court. "We're going to make sure Douglas Munro learns the most expensive lesson of his privileged life. I'm not interested in simply winning a divorce settlement, Harry," I said, and I could hear the steel in my own voice that had been hidden beneath decades of gracious acquiescence. "I want him to understand that discarding me was the worst mistake he's ever made." She looked at me for a long moment, seeing not the elegant socialite who'd been humiliated at her own birthday party, but the woman who'd spent years quietly building a case against her own husband while he congratulated himself on his superior intelligence. "Revenge is a dish best served cold," she said finally, "but it's even more satisfying when it's served with perfect style and absolute precision." "I want to throw a party," I said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. "Something elegant and memorable, the kind of event that will be talked about for years. I want Douglas to attend, along with everyone who witnessed his performance today. And I want them to see exactly who Evelyn Munro really is when she's finished pretending to be invisible." Harry's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell me more," she said, and I could see her mind already working through the possibilities, calculating the perfect combination of legal strategy and social warfare that would give me not just victory, but the kind of poetic justice that would become legend. "I'll need help with the financial aspects," I said, thinking through the logistics of what I was contemplating. "Someone discreet and competent, who understands both wealth management and the value of absolute confidentiality." "Miles Carter," Harry said without hesitation. "He's been managing assets for discerning clients for 20 years, and he has a particular talent for helping people access resources they didn't know they controlled. More importantly, he has absolutely no patience for men who try to cheat their wives out of what they've earned." I felt something that had been tightly wound in my chest begin to relax for the first time in hours. Harry was right, I wasn't facing this battle alone, and I wasn't the helpless victim Douglas believed he'd created. I was a woman with resources, intelligence, and most importantly, the element of surprise. "Can you arrange an introduction?" I asked, already mentally preparing for the next phase of what was beginning to feel less like disaster recovery and more like strategic deployment. "I'll call him tonight," Harry replied, making a note on her legal pad with the satisfaction of a general planning a campaign. "But first, tell me exactly what kind of party you have in mind." Miles Carter's office occupied the top floor of a discreet building in the financial district, the kind of place where serious money was managed by people who understood that true wealth preferred anonymity to ostentation. The reception area was decorated with museum-quality art that whispered rather than shouted its value, and the staff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who dealt regularly with clients who could buy and sell small countries if the mood struck them. I'd spent the morning preparing for this meeting with the same care I'd once devoted to important social functions, selecting a navy Chanel suit that conveyed serious business intentions while maintaining the feminine elegance that had always been my signature. My briefcase, a graduation gift from my father when I'd completed my degree in interior design, back when I'd still believed I would have a career rather than a marriage, contained copies of every document I'd gathered over the past 5 years. Organized with the precision that had once made me invaluable to Douglas's political campaigns, Miles himself was not what I'd expected from Harry's description of him as devastatingly competent and absolutely trustworthy. Instead of the silver-haired patrician I'd anticipated, he was perhaps 55, with the kind of understated attractiveness that comes from intelligence and excellent health rather than conventional handsomeness. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, his smile warm without being presumptuous, and his office was furnished with the quiet luxury that signaled serious money managed by serious people. Mrs. Monroe, he said, gesturing toward a leather chair positioned across from his desk in a way that suggested consultation rather than supplication. Harry tells me you found yourself in an interesting situation. My husband served me with divorce papers yesterday at what I believed was my birthday celebration, I replied, settling into the chair with the composure I'd learned to maintain regardless of the circumstances. He did so in front of witnesses, including the woman he intends to marry as soon as our divorce is finalized. Miles nodded with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories countless times before, but his eyes sharpened with professional interest when I continued. However, I don't believe Douglas has been entirely forthcoming about the extent of our marital assets, and I've spent considerable time documenting what I believe to be a systematic effort to hide resources from any potential divorce settlement. Show me, he said simply, and I appreciated that he didn't waste time with expressions of sympathy or outrage that would have felt performative. I opened my briefcase and began laying out the documents I'd copied and organized, explaining the pattern I'd identified in Douglas's financial behavior over the past 5 years. Miles examined each document with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, occasionally making notes on his legal pad or asking specific questions about dates and amounts. When I finished my presentation, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with something that might have been admiration. Mrs. Monroe, he said finally, you've essentially conducted a forensic accounting investigation of your own marriage. The documentation you've compiled would take most private investigators months to gather, and they'd charge substantial fees for work that isn't nearly this comprehensive. I had excellent motivation, I replied, and I could hear the edge in my voice that had been developing since Douglas's performance at the brunch. My husband has always believed that women are naturally inferior to men in matters of finance and business. It never occurred to him that I might be capable of understanding exactly what he was doing with our money. Miles leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional interest to something more personal. Harry mentioned that you're not simply looking for a fair divorce settlement, he said. She suggested that you might be interested in a more comprehensive resolution to your situation. I want Douglas to understand that discarding me was the worst mistake of his privileged life, I said, and for the first time in decades, I didn't soften my words or modify my tone to make them more palatable. I want him to realize that the wife he considered an elegant accessory was actually the architect of much of his success, and I want that realization to cost him significantly more than he's prepared to pay. Miles smiled, and it was the smile of a man who enjoyed his work considerably more when it involved delivering justice to people who deserved it. In that case, he said, I think we should discuss exactly what resources you have access to, and how we might leverage those resources to maximum effect. What followed was the most invigorating conversation I'd had in years. Miles walked me through the complex web of trusts, shell companies, and offshore accounts that Douglas had created, helping me understand not just what existed, but how the various entities were connected and where I might have legal standing to assert control. The most interesting discovery, he said, pulling up a document on his computer screen, is this trust that was established 22 years ago to hold the deed to your estate. Do you remember signing papers related to this trust? I did remember. Vaguely. It had been during Douglas's first mayoral campaign, when his advisors had recommended restructuring our assets for political and tax purposes. I'd signed dozens of documents without paying much attention to the details, trusting Douglas to handle what he described as boring legal technicalities that you don't need to worry about. According to the trust documents, Miles continued, you're listed as the primary beneficiary and successor trustee. Douglas positioned himself as the managing trustee, but your signature is required for any major transactions involving trust assets. I felt something cold and delicious settle in my stomach as I realized the implications of what he was telling me. Are you saying that Douglas cannot sell the house without my permission? I'm saying that Douglas cannot sell the house, transfer the deed, or in any way dispose of the property without your explicit written consent, Miles replied, and his smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. He structured this trust to protect the estate from potential creditors during his political career, but in doing so, he inadvertently gave you veto power over the asset he probably considers his most valuable possession. Can I use the property without his permission? I asked, already beginning to formulate the outlines of a plan that would be worthy of the education and strategy and tactics that Douglas had inadvertently provided me over the years. You're the beneficiary, Miles said. You can absolutely use the property. In fact, you could make a strong legal argument that you should be managing the trust assets since Douglas has demonstrated questionable judgment in his personal financial dealings. I thought about the party I'd mentioned to Harry, the elegant spectacle that would serve as both celebration and revelation, and I realized that I had the perfect venue already under my control. Miles, I said, leaning forward with the focused intensity that had once made me formidable in charity fundraising negotiations, I want to throw the most memorable party of the social season. Something that will be talked about for years, that will establish exactly who Evelyn Monroe is when she's finished being Douglas Monroe's supporting actress. Tell me more, he said, and I could see that he was already calculating the logistics of what I was contemplating. I want to use the estate, naturally. I want to invite everyone who matters in our social circle, including everyone who witnessed Douglas's performance yesterday. I want the event to be spectacular enough that people will be honored to attend, and I want Douglas to be there to see exactly what he's lost. I paused, thinking through the implications of what I was planning. And I want to pay for everything using resources that Douglas doesn't know I can access. Miles opened a different file on his computer and began scrolling through what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of my financial position. You have more options than you might realize, he said. Some of the shell companies Douglas established to hide assets are actually held in trusts where you have beneficial ownership. With proper documentation, we can access those funds for legitimate purposes, such as hosting a social event at my own home. I asked, such as hosting a social event at your own home, he confirmed. Douglas created this financial structure to benefit his family while hiding assets from potential creditors or political opponents. He didn't anticipate that his family might include a wife who understood exactly how to use the system he'd created. I felt a surge of power that was unlike anything I'd experienced during my marriage, the intoxicating realization that I wasn't the victim in this situation. I was the player Douglas had never seen coming. How quickly can we access the funds I'll need? Give me 48 hours to prepare the proper documentation, Miles said, making notes on his legal pad with the efficiency of someone who'd orchestrated similar financial reversals many times before. How much are you thinking you'll need for this party? I considered the scale of what I was contemplating, the kind of event that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, the sort of spectacular that would establish my reputation as a force to be reckoned with rather than a discarded wife. $250,000, I said. Maybe $300,000 if we're going to do this properly. Miles nodded as if I'd suggested spending money on groceries rather than planning what was essentially a financial and social nuclear strike against my soon-to-be ex-husband. Completely reasonable for an event of the caliber you're describing, he said. And poetic justice, considering the source of the funds. There's one more thing, I said, thinking about the long-term implications of what we were planning. I don't want this to be simply about revenge, although I'll admit that revenge is a significant motivating factor. I want Douglas to understand that he's not divorcing a dependent wife who'll fade quietly into obscurity. I want him to realize that he's created an enemy who understands his weaknesses better than anyone else in the world. Miles closed the files on his computer and looked at me with an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal approval. Mrs. Monroe, he said, I think you're going to discover that the most satisfying revenge is the kind that doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like success, independence, and the natural consequences of underestimating a remarkable woman. I gathered my documents and returned them to my briefcase, feeling more energized and focused than I had in years. Douglas had wanted to discard me to replace me with a younger woman who would appreciate his success without understanding the work that had created it. Instead, he'd freed me to become the woman I'd always been beneath the careful facade of the perfect wife. Thank you, Miles, I said, standing and extending my hand with the confidence that comes from knowing you're no longer fighting this battle alone. I'll look forward to hearing from you in 48 hours. Mrs. Monroe, he said, accepting my handshake with warmth that felt genuinely personal rather than merely professional. It's going to be my pleasure to help you throw the party of the century. As I left his office and walked toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished marble of the building's lobby and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She had the same face, The same carefully styled hair, the same expensive clothes, but there was something different in her eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that transformed elegance into something approaching dangerous. Douglas Munro had created his own nemesis, and she was going to be absolutely spectacular. Marco Delacroix possessed the rare combination of artistic vision and logistical precision that made him the most sought-after event planner among the social elite, who understood that true luxury lay not in ostentation but in flawless execution of seemingly impossible dreams. His Beverly Hills office was a testament to his philosophy that elegance should whisper rather than shout, with fresh orchids arranged in crystal vases that caught the afternoon light like captured rainbows, and furniture that managed to be both comfortable and museum-worthy. He greeted me at the door himself, a gesture that spoke to both his personal charm and his understanding that I represented the kind of client who could make or destroy reputations with a single perfectly crafted event. At 58, Marco had retained the lean elegance of a dancer and the sharp eyes of someone who could spot a social disaster from 3 rooms away, skills that had made him indispensable to women who needed to make statements that would be remembered for decades rather than dismissed as desperate attempts at relevance. "Mrs. Munro," he said, taking my hands in both of his with the warmth that had made him genuinely beloved by clients who usually trusted no one completely. "Harry tells me you're planning something special. Something that will remind certain people exactly who they're dealing with." His office was clearly prepared for our meeting, with fabric samples arranged like a painter's palette across his antique desk. Photographs of his most memorable events displayed with the pride of a general reviewing successful campaigns, and a bottle of champagne cooling in a silver bucket that suggested celebration rather than mere business consultation. Marco understood that planning the perfect revenge required the same attention to detail and emotional investment as planning the perfect wedding, perhaps more so since the stakes were considerably higher. "I want to throw a party," I said, settling into the velvet chair he indicated while accepting the glass of champagne he poured with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. "That will be talked about for the next 20 years. Something elegant enough to attract everyone who matters, spectacular enough to generate the kind of coverage that establishes reputations, and personal enough to make a very specific statement about who Evelyn Munro really is." Marco's eyes lit with the enthusiasm of an artist who'd been commissioned to create a masterpiece, and he pulled out a leather portfolio that contained sketches and photographs from events that had made social history. "Tell me about the statement you want to make," he said, settling into his own chair with the focused attention that had made him legendary among women who needed their public moments to be absolutely perfect. "My husband served me with divorce papers at what I thought was my 60th birthday celebration," I began, watching Marco's face as he processed the calculated cruelty of Douglas's approach. "He did so in front of witnesses, including the woman he intends to marry as soon as our divorce is finalized. I want to host an event that will demonstrate exactly what he's losing, and I want him to attend so he can witness firsthand the magnitude of his mistake." Marco set down his champagne and leaned forward with the intensity that had made him successful in a field where failure meant social death for both planner and client. "Revenge is an art form," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent that remained from his childhood in Provence, "and the most beautiful revenge is the kind that doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like triumph, like celebration, like a woman stepping into her power with such grace that everyone wonders why they never noticed her brilliance before." He was right, of course. The kind of party I was envisioning couldn't be an obvious attack on Douglas, couldn't appear desperate or vindictive to the people whose opinions would shape how the story was told and retold in the years to come. It had to be the kind of event that would make people say they'd always known I was remarkable, that they'd always suspected I was the real power behind Douglas's success, that they weren't surprised to see me emerge from his shadow as the fascinating woman I'd always been. "I'm thinking late spring," I said, consulting the calendar I'd begun keeping specifically for this project. "Perhaps early May, when the estate gardens are at their most beautiful. Something that takes advantage of the natural beauty of the property while adding enough theatrical elements to make it truly unforgettable." Marco began sketching as I spoke, his hands moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent decades translating women's dreams into reality. "The estate," he said, and I could hear the professional appreciation in his voice as he considered the venue I was offering him. "I've driven past it many times, of course. but I've never had the opportunity to work with those grounds. Tell me about the spaces we'll have available. I described the formal gardens that I'd spent 15 years perfecting, the infinity pool that could be transformed into a reflecting pool for the evening, the tennis court that could serve as a dance floor under the stars, and the sunroom where Douglas had humiliated me just days ago, which could become the perfect setting for my own carefully orchestrated revelation. Marco listened with the attention of a general studying terrain before a battle, occasionally asking questions about sightlines and electrical access and the logistics of moving large numbers of people through spaces designed for intimate gatherings. How many guests are you thinking? He asked, and I could see him already calculating the complex choreography that would be required to make the evening flow seamlessly from cocktails to dinner to whatever climax I had planned. 200, I said, thinking about the carefully curated list I'd been mental compiling. Everyone who witnessed Douglas's performance at the brunch, everyone who matters in our social and business circles, everyone whose opinion will shape how this story is remembered. I want it to be large enough to feel significant, but small enough to maintain intimacy and control. Marco nodded approvingly, making notes in the margins of his sketches with the efficiency that had made him indispensable to clients who demanded perfection. And the theme? He asked. The story we're telling through the evening's progression? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the narrative arc that would transform me from Douglas's discarded wife into the woman I was meant to be. Rebirth, I said finally. The emergence of someone who's been hidden in plain sight, who's finally ready to claim her proper place in the world. I want it to feel like a debut rather than a farewell, like a beginning rather than an ending. Perfect, Marco said, and his smile was the smile of an artist who'd found his inspiration. We'll start with cocktails in the formal gardens, something that feels familiar and comfortable to your guests, that lets them appreciate the beauty of the setting, while they wonder what you have planned. Then dinner on the terrace, with entertainment that showcases your sophistication and taste, followed by dancing under the stars and whatever revelation you've planned for the grand finale. As he spoke, I could see the evening taking shape in his mind, could almost hear the music and laughter that would fill the spaces where I'd spent so many years feeling invisible and undervalued. This wouldn't be just a party, it would be a transformation, a public declaration that Evelyn Monroe was no longer content to be anyone's supporting actress. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There's one more element, I said, thinking about the timing that would be crucial to the evening's success. I want Douglas to attend, but I don't want him to know what he's walking into until it's too late for him to leave gracefully. The invitation should feel like an olive branch, like I'm trying to maintain civility for the sake of our mutual friends and business associates. Marco's eyes gleamed with appreciation for the psychological complexity of what I was planning. A Trojan horse, he said approvingly. An invitation so gracious and seemingly conciliatory that refusing would make him look petty and defensive. He'll have to attend, and by the time he realizes what's happening, he'll be trapped by the very social obligations he's always used to his advantage. We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of the evening, from the flowers that would echo the gardens while adding touches of unexpected drama to the menu that would demonstrate my understanding of sophisticated entertaining, to the lighting that would make everyone look beautiful while ensuring that key moments would be perfectly illuminated for the photographers I planned to invite. The budget? Marco asked finally, and I could see him calculating the cost of creating the kind of perfection we were discussing. Whatever it takes to make this absolutely flawless, I replied, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Miles Carter and the resources I'd discovered were available to me. I want people to talk about this party for the next 20 years. To remember it as the night they realized they'd completely underestimated Evelyn Monroe. Marco closed his portfolio and looked at me with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his next masterpiece. Mrs. Monroe, he said, raising his champagne glass in a toast that felt like a declaration of war, it's going to be my absolute pleasure to help you become legendary. As I drove home from Marco's office, I felt the intoxicating rush that comes from setting large forces in motion, from knowing that I was no longer reacting to Douglas's betrayal, but actively creating the circumstances that would define how our story ended. The party was just the beginning, the opening move in a game that Douglas didn't even know we were playing. My phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram, and I glanced at It well stopped at a red light to see that Celeste had posted a series of photographs from what appeared to be a luxury hotel in Paris, her artificially perfect smile beaming from various locations around the city of light while she posed with shopping bags from boutiques that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The captions were calculated to suggest sophisticated European travel while broadcasting her availability and desirability to her followers. But what caught my attention was the geotag that placed her thousands of miles away during the exact period when Douglas would be receiving legal papers related to our divorce proceedings. How convenient, I thought. Screenshot the posts before she had a chance to delete them, that his future wife should be establishing such a clear alibi for herself while Douglas dealt with the messy details of ending his current marriage. It was the kind of strategic absence that spoke to careful planning rather than coincidental timing, and I filed the information away for future reference. The game was becoming more interesting by the hour, and I was beginning to understand that I had more players on the board than I'd initially realized. Sasha arrived unannounced on Thursday afternoon, using the key I'd given her years ago with the understanding that my home would always be her sanctuary regardless of whatever chaos might be consuming her adult life. At 32, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genetics and better skincare, but more importantly, she'd inherited my ability to read people and situations with the precision of a sociologist conducting field research. Her relationship with Ingrid had taught her to question the assumptions that had shaped our family dynamics, and I'd watched her grow increasingly comfortable with challenging the narratives that Douglas had carefully constructed around our perfect family life. I found her in the kitchen, making tea with the methodical precision that had always been her way of processing difficult emotions, her dark hair pulled back in the messy bun that made her look like a graduate student despite her success as a nonprofit development director. She was wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive, a combination that spoke to the confidence that came from never having to worry about money while also never taking that privilege for granted. "Mom," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the particular tone that meant she was preparing for a conversation that would require careful navigation. "We need to talk about what happened at the brunch." I settled into the breakfast nook where we'd shared countless conversations over the years, watching her move through the familiar ritual of preparing Earl Grey tea with the same attention to detail I'd taught her as a child. Sasha had always been my confidant among the children, the one who'd inherited my ability to see through social performance to the emotional reality underneath, and I'd known that this conversation was inevitable from the moment Douglas had served me those papers. "What did your father tell you?" I asked, accepting the perfectly prepared cup of tea she handed me while settling into the seat across from mine with the grace that had made her genuinely popular rather than simply socially connected. "That you'd both realized you'd grown in different directions over the years, and that you'd mutually decided it was time to pursue separate paths," she said, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice that suggested she'd inherited more of my intelligence than Douglas had ever given her credit for. He made it sound very civilized and mature, like something out of a lifestyle magazine article about conscious uncoupling. The phrase made me laugh despite the circumstances, a genuine sound of amusement that surprised us both with its lightness. "Your father has always had a talent for reframing reality to support whatever narrative serves his purposes," I said, thinking about the years I'd watched him transform political defeats into moral victories and business failures into learning experiences. "The truth is somewhat less civilized and considerably less mutual." Sasha leaned forward with the focused attention that had made her successful in her career working with wealthy donors who required careful handling, and I realized that I was looking at a woman who'd learned to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with the same skill I'd once brought to managing Douglas's political campaigns. "Mom," she said carefully, "I love Dad, but I've always known he has a tendency to rewrite history when it doesn't reflect well on him. Tell me what really happened." So I did. I told her about the careful choreography of the birthday brunch, about Celeste's strategic positioning and the photographer who'd been hired to document my humiliation, about the envelope that had dissolved 35 years of marriage into legal terminology and financial calculations. I told her about the years I'd spent supporting Douglas's ambitions while he gradually marginalized my contributions, about the slowly dawning realization that he was systematically moving assets beyond my reach in preparation for exactly this kind of betrayal. Sasha listened without interruption, her expression shifting from concern to anger to something that looked like professional respect as she began to understand the complexity of what Douglas had orchestrated. "Jesus," she said, finally, setting down her teacup with the careful precision that indicated she was working to control her own emotional response. "He really thought this through, didn't he? The public setting, the witnesses, the timing. It's like he hired a consultant to design the most humiliating possible way to end a marriage." "Your father has always been thorough when it comes to protecting his own interests," I replied, thinking about the countless times I'd watched him outmaneuver opponents who'd underestimated his willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. "What surprises me is that he never considered the possibility that I might have learned something about strategy and planning during all those years of watching him work." Something in my tone made Sasha look at me more carefully, and I saw the moment when she began to realize that I wasn't the devastated victim she'd expected to find. "Mom," she said slowly, "what aren't you telling me?" Before I could answer, we heard the front door open and James's voice calling out his arrival with the casual assumption of welcome that had marked his relationship with our home since childhood. At 35, he possessed Douglas's natural charm and physical presence, but he'd also inherited a tendency toward emotional blindness that made him genuinely surprised when people didn't respond to situations the way he expected them to. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like a younger version of his father, all expensive casual wear and confident posture, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was less comfortable with the current family situation than he wanted to appear. "Mom," he said, crossing to kiss my cheek with the automatic affection that had always characterized our relationship, "I wanted to stop by and make sure you're handling everything okay." "Everything? Meaning your father's decision to divorce me?" I asked, and I could hear the slight edge in my voice that suggested I was less interested in protecting James's comfort than I'd been in previous family conversations. James had the grace to look uncomfortable, settling into the third chair at our breakfast table with the careful positioning of someone who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. "Dad says you're both handling this very maturely," he said, and I could hear him testing the waters to see how I would respond to Douglas's version of events. "Your father has his own perspective on maturity," I replied, thinking about the calculated cruelty of serving divorce papers at a birthday celebration. "I'm curious about yours." The question seemed to catch James off guard, and I realized that he'd probably expected to find me devastated and grateful for his support rather than calm and apparently in control of the situation. "I think," he said carefully, "that sometimes people grow apart, and it's better to acknowledge that honestly rather than pretending everything is fine when it isn't." It was a reasonable response, the kind of diplomatic answer that had served James well in his role managing business development for one of Douglas's companies, but it also revealed that he'd accepted Douglas's narrative without questioning whether there might be another side to the story. Sasha was watching this exchange with the sharp attention of someone who was beginning to understand that family loyalties were more complicated than she'd previously realized. "James," Sasha said suddenly, "did Dad ask you to come check on Mom?" The question hit its target with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning to identify manipulation in professional settings, and I watched James's face as he realized that his sister had seen through whatever instructions he'd received. "He's concerned about her," James said, defensively. "This is a difficult time for both of them, and he wants to make sure she has support." "Support?" I repeated, tasting the word like wine that had gone slightly off. How thoughtful of him to be concerned about my well-being after serving me divorce papers at my own birthday party. James looked genuinely surprised, as if this was the first time he'd heard Douglas's timing described in terms that made it sound calculated rather than unfortunate. "Dad said the timing wasn't ideal," he said, "but that the lawyers advised him to move quickly for tax purposes related to the property transfers he's been working on." Property transfers. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach as I realized that James wasn't just supporting Douglas emotionally, he was apparently helping him with the financial restructuring that was designed to minimize my settlement. "What property transfers?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the fury building in my chest. "The offshore consulting business," James said, clearly not understanding why I would be interested in details that Douglas had probably Told him were too complex for me to understand. Dad's been working with Celeste's business manager to streamline the corporate structure, and apparently there are some regulatory deadlines that require moving quickly. Celeste's business manager. I filed that information away while maintaining the expression of mild interest that had served me well during countless conversations where I'd learned more by appearing slightly confused than I ever could have by demonstrating my actual understanding of the subject being discussed. That sounds very complicated, I said, playing into the role that Douglas had apparently assigned me in James's understanding of our family dynamics. I'm sure your father knows what he's doing. Sasha was watching this exchange with growing comprehension, and I could see her beginning to understand that there were layers to our family situation that she'd never previously considered. When James excused himself 20 minutes later claiming he had a conference call with clients in Hong Kong, she waited until we heard his car pull out of the driveway before turning to me with an expression that mixed admiration with something approaching awe. "Mom," she said, "you're not falling apart at all, are you? You're planning something." I looked at my daughter, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited the best of both her parents while somehow avoiding their worst tendencies, and made a decision that would change the nature of our relationship forever. "Sasha," I said, "how would you feel about helping me throw the most memorable party of the decade?" Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and in that moment, I saw exactly where she'd gotten her talent for reading people and situations with surgical precision. "Tell me more," she said, and I realized that I'd just gained the most valuable ally I could have imagined. "There's someone I want you to meet," I said, thinking about Ingrid's background in data analysis and her complete lack of loyalty to Douglas's version of family harmony. "Someone who might be very helpful in making sure we have all the information we need to make this party absolutely perfect." Ingrid Chen possessed the rare combination of technical brilliance and social awareness that made her invaluable to nonprofit organizations that needed to understand their donors' digital footprints while maintaining the discretion that separated professional fundraising from stalking. At 28, she'd already established herself as one of the most sought-after data analysts in the philanthropy sector, with a client list that included organizations whose board meetings read like a who's who of American wealth and influence. She arrived at the estate on Saturday morning carrying a laptop that looked like it could probably hack into government databases and wearing the kind of understated designer clothes that suggested she understood exactly how much money her skills were worth. Her relationship with Sasha had introduced her to our family's social circles, but she'd maintained the outsider's perspective that allowed her to see patterns and connections that people embedded in the system often missed. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, accepting the coffee I offered with the efficiency of someone who understood that this was a business meeting disguised as a social call. "Sasha tells me you're planning an event that will require some specialized research." We were sitting in my office, the elegant space where I'd spent countless hours managing charitable foundations and maintaining the social connections that had enhanced Douglas's reputation. But today it felt different, less like a retreat from the real business of the world and more like mission control for an operation that would reshape the landscape of our entire social circle. "I'm throwing a party," I said, opening the secure folder on my laptop where I'd been compiling information about the guests I planned to invite and the story I intended to tell through the evening's carefully orchestrated events. "But I want to make sure I understand all the players involved, particularly some of the newer additions to our social circle." Ingrid nodded with the professional focus that had made her reputation in data analysis, pulling out her own laptop and a legal pad where she'd apparently already begun making notes. "You're talking about Celeste Ambers," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Sasha mentioned that she's become a factor in your family's situation." "Douglas's girlfriend," I confirmed, thinking about the woman who'd positioned herself so carefully at the birthday brunch, who'd managed to convey sympathy while establishing her claim on my husband with the precision of someone who'd studied the social dynamics involved. "She's a lifestyle influencer with approximately 200,000 followers and what appears to be a very strategic approach to personal branding. I've looked at her accounts," Ingrid said, opening her laptop and pulling up what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of Celeste's digital presence. "Interesting woman. She's very careful about what she shares and when she shares it, which suggests a level of sophistication that goes beyond typical influencer behavior." The screen filled with screenshots of Celeste's posts from the past 6 months, arranged in a timeline that revealed patterns I wouldn't have noticed without professional analysis. Her content was indeed carefully curated, with each post designed to reinforce specific messages about her lifestyle, her connections, and her availability to the kind of man who could provide access to genuine luxury rather than the Instagram simulation of wealth. What's particularly interesting, Ingrid continued, highlighting specific posts with the precision of an archaeologist examining artifacts, is the timing of certain content. Look at this pattern of travel posts. They correspond almost exactly with periods when your husband had significant business dealings or social events that might have been awkward if she'd been present. I leaned forward to study the timeline Ingrid had created, beginning to see the strategic intelligence that had attracted Douglas to Celeste in the first place. She wasn't simply a young woman who'd caught his eye at a social function. She was someone who understood the long-term planning required to position herself as the ideal replacement for a wife who'd become inconvenient. She's been planning this relationship, I said, recognizing the same kind of careful positioning I'd once used to advance Douglas's political career. How long has she been laying the groundwork? At least 18 months, Ingrid replied, pulling up earlier posts that showed Celeste gradually inserting herself into the social circles where she would eventually meet Douglas. She started following key people in your husband's network long before there's any evidence of direct contact between them. She was studying the landscape. It was impressive, in a way that made me respect Celeste's intelligence while also understanding that she represented a more formidable opponent than I'd initially realized. Douglas hadn't simply been seduced by a beautiful young woman. He'd been targeted by someone who understood exactly what she wanted and had developed a comprehensive strategy for getting it. There's something else, Ingrid said, her voice taking on the tone that indicated she'd found information that was both significant and potentially problematic. I've been looking at the financial connections between Celeste and some of the business entities associated with your husband's companies. She pulled up a different screen, this one showing a complex web of financial relationships that made my head spin with their intricacy. Celeste has been receiving regular payments from a consulting company that's owned by one of your husband's business partners, she said, highlighting the relevant transfers with the precision of someone who'd spent years tracking money through deliberately complex corporate structures. Consulting payments for what? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that the answer would reveal another layer of the careful planning that had gone into my marriage's destruction. That's the interesting question, Ingrid replied. The payments started about a year ago, and they're structured in a way that suggests they're meant to be difficult to trace. But they're also substantial. We're talking about amounts that would be significant income for someone at Celeste's level of influence or success. I stared at the financial data, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place, with the satisfying precision of a lock opening under a master key. She's been paid to pursue Douglas, I said, understanding finally that what I'd witnessed wasn't simply a midlife crisis but a carefully orchestrated corporate acquisition disguised as a love affair. It's possible, Ingrid said carefully, though. Proving intent would be challenging without access to the original consulting agreements. But there's definitely a financial relationship that predates any public evidence of a romantic connection. I thought about the birthday brunch, about Celeste's perfect positioning and practiced sympathy, about the photographer who'd been hired to document my humiliation, and I realized that every detail had been planned with the precision of a military operation. Douglas hadn't simply decided to divorce me. He'd commissioned my replacement and scripted my dismissal with the same attention to detail he'd once brought to political campaigns. Ingrid, I said, feeling the cold fury that had been building in my chest crystallize into something sharp and purposeful. I need you to document everything you found. I want records of the payments, the timing, the corporate connections, everything that establishes the financial relationship between Celeste and Douglas's business interests. Done, she replied, already saving files to what appeared to be multiple secure locations. What are you planning to do with this information? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the party I was planning and the various ways that carefully revealed information could be more devastating than direct accusations. I'm going to make sure the right people understand exactly what kind of business relationship has been developing in our social circle, I said. Some of our friends might be very interested to learn that the influencer they've been following has been operating as a paid consultant in matters that affect their own marriages and business relationships. Ingrid smiled with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated elegant solutions to complex problems. There's one more thing, she said, pulling up another screen that showed recent activity on Celeste's accounts. She's been posting from Paris for the past week, but there are some inconsistencies in the metadata that suggest not all of those posts are actually originating from France. Meaning what? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that Celeste's European vacation might be another carefully constructed fiction, meaning that some of her live from Paris content was probably created locally and scheduled for posting, designed to establish an alibi for her location during a period when she might not want to be directly associated with whatever business Douglas is conducting, Ingrid explained. It's sophisticated social media management disguised as spontaneous travel documentation. I felt the pieces of my revenge falling into place with the precision of a Swiss watch, understanding finally that I wasn't simply competing with a younger woman for Douglas's affection. I was going up against a professional who'd been hired to replace me with the same calculated precision that Douglas brought to all his business dealings. Perfect, I said, reaching for my phone to make a call I'd been contemplating since my meeting with Miles Carter. I think it's time Detective Lang learned about some interesting financial patterns that might be relevant to his ongoing investigations into corporate consulting arrangements. The call took less than 5 minutes, a carefully neutral conversation in which I mentioned that I'd recently discovered some financial documents that might be of interest to law enforcement, documents that suggested potential irregularities in consulting payments between related business entities. I provided no specifics, made no accusations, simply suggested that someone with appropriate expertise might want to examine the relationships I'd identified. Detective Lang was professional and appropriately cautious, making no commitments while expressing appreciation for my civic-mindedness in bringing potential issues to his attention. The conversation was recorded automatically, as all such calls were, creating an official record of my cooperation with law enforcement while establishing a clear timeline for any investigations that might follow. When I hung up, Ingrid was watching me with an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal approval. You're not just throwing a party, she said, you're orchestrating a complete, systematic takedown. I'm simply making sure that the truth has an opportunity to emerge, I replied, feeling more energized and focused than I had in years. Douglas has spent our entire marriage teaching me that the most effective warfare is the kind that doesn't look like warfare at all. It's time he learned exactly how good a student I've been. I pulled out the elegant stationery I'd had made for special occasions, cream-colored paper with my monogram embossed in gold, and began composing an invitation that would serve as both olive branch and declaration of war. The language was perfect, gracious, conciliatory, designed to make refusal appear petty and defensive while ensuring that acceptance would trap the recipient in exactly the scenario I was designing. Dear Celeste, I wrote in my practice script, I hope you're enjoying your time in Paris and that the City of Light is providing you with exactly the inspiration you're seeking. I wanted to personally invite you to a small gathering I'm hosting at the estate next month, a celebration of new beginnings and the importance of understanding exactly who we're dealing with in our personal and professional relationships. I do hope you'll be able to attend. I have a feeling it will be an evening you'll remember for the rest of your life. The invitation was a masterpiece of subtext, containing multiple layers of meaning that would become increasingly clear as the evening I was planning unfolded. Celeste would have to attend, both to maintain her position in Douglas's life and to avoid appearing threatened by the woman she was replacing. But she'd also be walking into a carefully prepared trap that would expose the financial relationships she'd worked so hard to keep hidden. Ingrid, I said, sealing the invitation in an envelope that would be hand-delivered by messenger service, I think you're going to find the next few weeks very interesting indeed. Gloria Whitman had spent 30 years transforming herself from ambitious journalism major to the most influential social chronicler on the West Coast, with a weekly column that was read by everyone who mattered and feared by anyone with secrets worth hiding. Her power lay not in her ability to uncover scandals, though she was formidable in that regard, but in her talent for crafting narratives that shaped how society understood the people and events that defined their world. She arrived at my office on Tuesday afternoon, carrying the leather portfolio that had become her signature accessory and wearing the kind of understated designer suit that conveyed serious journalistic credentials while acknowledging the social prominence of her readership. At 65, Gloria had maintained the sharp elegance that had made her a welcome presence at elite gatherings for decades, but her eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency. In her particular economy, Evelyn, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the comfortable authority of someone who'd conducted thousands of similar meetings, I understand you're planning something that might be of interest to my readers. I'd been preparing for this conversation since deciding to include Gloria in my guest list, understanding that her presence would transform my party from a private social event into a public statement that would be analyzed and discussed throughout the interconnected networks of wealth and influence that shaped our region's social landscape. Gloria's coverage could make or break reputations, and her interpretation of events often became the definitive version of truth that survived in collective memory. I'm hosting a gathering to celebrate new beginnings, I said, opening the portfolio, where I'd been organizing the details of the evening I was planning, something that acknowledges the ways that relationships evolve and the importance of understanding who we really are beneath the roles we've been playing. Gloria's eyebrows rose with the professional interest of someone who'd spent decades learning to identify stories that would resonate with her audience, and she pulled out her own notebook with the efficiency that had made her legendary among publicists who needed their clients' stories told with exactly the right combination of discretion and impact. New beginnings, she repeated, making notes in the shorthand that had served her through countless interviews with people who spoke in careful euphemisms about subjects that couldn't be discussed directly. I assume this relates to the recent changes in your personal situation? Douglas and I are divorcing, I said, using the direct language that Gloria would appreciate after years of dealing with people who tried to manage her coverage through careful manipulation of information. The proceedings have been somewhat more public than I would have preferred, but that's given me an opportunity to clarify some misconceptions about who I am and what I'm capable of achieving independently. Gloria leaned forward with the focused attention that indicated she was beginning to understand that I was offering her something more significant than routine social coverage, something that might qualify as the kind of exclusive story that defined careers and shaped reputations throughout the industries she covered. Tell me about the misconceptions, she said, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that had allowed her to extract confidences from people who normally trusted no one with their secrets. I spent the next hour walking Gloria through the carefully curated version of my story that I'd been developing, emphasizing the strategic intelligence I'd hidden throughout my marriage, the financial acumen I'd developed while managing our various charitable and business interests, and the network of relationships I'd cultivated that extended far beyond the supporting role Douglas had assigned me in his public narrative. Gloria listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but primarily focusing on understanding the larger themes that would make my story compelling to readers who appreciated sophisticated analyses of power dynamics within elite social circles. She was particularly interested in the details of how I'd discovered and documented Douglas's financial maneuvering, recognizing that the story of an underestimated wife turning the tables on her overconfident husband would resonate with her audience's appreciation for poetic justice. This party you're planning, she said finally, closing her notebook with the satisfaction of someone who'd identified a story worth telling. I assume it's designed to demonstrate these capabilities you've been hiding? It's designed to celebrate the person I've always been, I replied, thinking about the evening Marco and I had been planning with the precision of generals preparing for a decisive battle. The person who helped build Douglas's success while allowing him to take credit for strategies and insights that were actually collaborative efforts. Gloria smiled with the appreciation of someone who understood exactly what kind of performance I was planning, recognizing that my party would serve as both social statement and business demonstration, establishing my independent credibility, while subtly undermining the narrative that Douglas had constructed around his own achievements. I'd be honored to attend, she said, and I could hear the professional excitement in her voice as she contemplated the coverage possibilities that my evening would provide. And I assume you'll be comfortable with my documenting the event for my readers? I'm counting on it, I replied, understanding that Gloria's presence would ensure that whatever happened at my party would be interpreted and remembered according to the narrative I was constructing rather than any alternative version that Douglas might try to promote. After Gloria left, I spent the afternoon finalizing the guest list that would make or break the evening I was planning, carefully balancing the need for witnesses who would understand the significance of what they were seeing against the risk of including people whose loyalties were too firmly established to be shifted by even the most compelling demonstration Of my capabilities, the list included everyone who had witnessed Douglas's performance at the birthday brunch, ensuring that they would have the opportunity to compare his version of our divorce with the reality I was preparing to reveal. It included business associates whose respect would be valuable in whatever career I decided to pursue after establishing my independence from Douglas's shadow. Most importantly, it included the handful of people whose opinions shaped how stories were understood and retold throughout the networks of influence that determined social reputations. Each invitation was handwritten on the elegant stationery I'd commissioned specifically for this event, with language that conveyed both the significance of the occasion and the exclusive nature of the guest list. The tone was gracious but confident, suggesting that attendance would be an honor rather than a social obligation, creating the kind of anticipation that would ensure robust participation and focused attention throughout the evening. My phone rang as I was addressing the final invitations, and I answered to find Douglas's voice carrying the particular combination of authority and condescension that had characterized most of our conversations over the past 35 years. But today, there was something else in his tone, a note of concern that suggested he was beginning to understand that the divorce proceedings weren't unfolding according to his carefully planned timeline. "Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying across the connection with the measured control that had served him well in political negotiations. "I understand you're planning some kind of event at the house." "I'm hosting a gathering," I replied, maintaining the neutral tone that had served me well during countless conversations where I'd needed to extract information while revealing nothing of my own plans. "Something to celebrate new beginnings and the importance of understanding who we really are." There was a pause that suggested Douglas was calculating the implications of what I was telling him, trying to determine whether my party represented a threat to the narrative he'd been constructing around our divorce or simply the kind of social activity he'd always expected me to pursue. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice carrying the patronizing patience that had always emerged when he believed he needed to explain reality to someone who lacked his sophisticated understanding of complex situations. "I think it would be better if we kept our personal business private while the divorce proceedings are ongoing. Having a large social event at this time might send the wrong message about our intentions." "What message would that be?" I asked, though I understood exactly what he was concerned about. Douglas had choreographed my public humiliation with the precision of a theater director, but now he was worried that I might have my own performance planned, something that could complicate the simple story he wanted told about our marriages. "And that we're not taking the situation seriously," he replied. "That we're treating the end of our marriage like some kind of social entertainment rather than the significant life change it represents for both of us." It was masterfully manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for planning an event that might embarrass him while positioning himself as the responsible party who was trying to handle our divorce with appropriate dignity. The old Evelyn would have apologized and canceled the party, grateful for his guidance and concerned about appearing inappropriately frivolous during such a serious time. "Douglas," I said, my voice carrying a steel that I hadn't allowed him to hear during our marriage, "you served me divorce papers at my own birthday party in front of witnesses. I think the standard for appropriate behavior has already been established." The silence that followed suggested that Douglas was recalibrating his approach, recognizing that the woman he was speaking to wasn't responding according to the patterns he'd learned to expect over 3 decades of marriage. When he spoke again, his voice carried the harder edge that emerged when persuasion failed and he needed to rely on more direct forms of control. "I'm asking you not to have this party," he said, dropping the pretense of concern for my well-being in favor of the direct command that had always been his fallback position when I showed signs of independence. "Cancel it, Evelyn. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, it's not worth the complications it will create." "I'm sorry you feel that way," I replied, understanding that this conversation marked the moment when our divorce transitioned from Douglas's carefully controlled narrative to something more like actual warfare. "But the invitations have already been sent, and I'm looking forward to celebrating with the people who matter most to me." I hung up before he could respond, feeling the intoxicating rush that comes from refusing to be controlled by someone who's spent years taking your compliance for granted. The evening I was planning had always been designed as a demonstration of my independence, but Douglas's attempt to prevent it had transformed the party into something more significant, a public declaration that I was no longer willing to be managed like a political asset or business property. My phone buzzed immediately with a text from James. "Mom, Dad says you're planning some kind of party at the house. Can we talk about this? I think there might be some legal issues with using the property while the divorce is pending." I smiled as I read the message, understanding that Douglas was now mobilizing whatever resources he could access to prevent the party that he was beginning. To understand might be more dangerous than he'd initially realized. But James didn't know about the trust documents that gave me legal control over the estate, didn't understand that Douglas had inadvertently provided me with unassailable rights to the property he now wanted to deny me. "The party is next Saturday." I texted back, "I hope you'll be able to attend. It's going to be an evening that clarifies a lot of things that have been unclear for far too long." As I sealed the final invitations and prepared them for hand delivery, I felt the satisfaction that comes from setting large forces in motion, from knowing that the careful plans I'd been developing were about to be tested against the reality of social and financial warfare at the highest levels of our community's power structure. Douglas had taught me that the most effective victories were the ones that didn't look like victories at all, that appeared to be natural consequences of superior intelligence and careful preparation rather than deliberate attacks designed to destroy one's opponents. Next Saturday evening, he was going to learn exactly how good a student I'd been, and the lesson was going to cost him considerably more than he'd ever imagined when he decided that replacing me would be a simple matter of serving divorce papers and moving on to his carefully selected upgrade. The war was about to begin, and I had every intention of winning it with the kind of elegant precision that would be remembered and discussed for decades to come. The morning of the party dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture, with golden light filtering through the estate's mature oak trees and illuminating the formal gardens that had been transformed overnight into something that belonged in the pages of Architectural Digest rather than reality. Marco and his team had worked with the precision of Swiss clockmakers, turning my carefully planned vision into a physical manifestation of elegance that would serve as the perfect backdrop for the performance I'd been rehearsing in my mind for weeks. I stood at my bedroom window, still in my silk robe, watching the final preparations unfold across the grounds that had been my prison and were about to become the stage for my liberation. The white tent that would shelter our dinner had been positioned to take advantage of the sunset that would paint the sky in shades of rose and gold just as we finished the main course, while the dance floor that had been installed beside the infinity pool would reflect the stars that were forecast to be brilliant in the clear sky that the weather service had promised. Everything was perfect, exactly as I'd envisioned it during those long nights when I'd lain beside Douglas planning the destruction of the life he'd believed he could discard without consequence. The irony wasn't lost on me that the party which would establish my independence was being held at the estate where I'd spent so many years feeling invisible, paid for with money that Douglas had tried to hide from me, and attended by people who'd witnessed what he'd believed was my final humiliation. Maria appeared in my doorway carrying the coffee service I'd requested, her weathered face showing the combination of concern and excitement that had marked her demeanor all week as she'd watched the preparations unfold. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, setting the silver tray on the table beside my window with the careful precision that had made her invaluable during all the years she'd managed our household. "The caterers are asking about the champagne service for cocktails. Dom P. Rignan 2008, I replied, remembering the case I'd discovered in Douglas's private wine cellar, bottles he'd been saving for some special occasion that would now serve as the perfect toast to my new beginning. "And make sure Gloria Whitman receives the vintage Krug. She'll appreciate the gesture, and I want her to remember every detail of this evening with complete clarity." I dressed for battle with the same attention to detail that generals devoted to choosing armor, selecting the midnight blue Valentino gown that had been hanging in my closet for 2 years, waiting for an occasion worthy of its dramatic elegance. The dress had been an impulse purchase during a moment of rebellion that I'd never acted upon, but tonight it would serve as the perfect costume for the woman I was finally ready to become. The diamonds I chose were Douglas's mother's, the set she'd given me for our 25th anniversary, with the grudging acknowledgement that I'd earned my place in the family through sheer persistence, if not actual worthiness. Tonight, they would serve as symbols of everything I'd inherited from the Monroe legacy, everything I'd helped build and would now claim as my own regardless of Douglas's attempts to rewrite the history of our partnership. By 7 o'clock, the first guests were arriving. their cars winding up the circular drive with the stately procession that marked gatherings of people who understood their own importance and expected events to be worthy of their attention. I positioned myself in the foyer, greeting each arrival with the warmth that had made me genuinely beloved by people who usually preferred Douglas's more calculated charm, watching their faces as they absorbed the magnificence of what Marco and I had created. "Evelyn," said Patricia Blackwood, Douglas's former business partner and one of the shrewdest women I'd ever known, taking my hands in both of hers with genuine affection, "this is absolutely breathtaking. I had no idea you were planning something so spectacular." "I wanted to celebrate new beginnings," I replied, guiding her toward the terrace where cocktails were being served against the backdrop of gardens that had never looked more beautiful. "And the importance of understanding exactly who we're dealing with in our personal and professional relationships." The words carried multiple layers of meaning that Patricia would undoubtedly analyze throughout the evening, but for now she simply smiled with the appreciation of someone who recognized excellent party planning when she experienced it. The guest list was performing exactly as I'd anticipated, with conversations flowing naturally between people who rarely had the opportunity to socialize outside of business obligations, creating the kind of relaxed atmosphere that would make whatever revelations I had planned seem like natural developments rather than calculated attacks. Douglas arrived at 8:15, precisely when I'd expected him based on 35 years of observing his social timing, and I felt the familiar mixture of attraction and revulsion that had characterized my feelings toward him for the past decade. He looked distinguished in his custom tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled and his smile carrying the automatic charm that had served him well throughout his political and business careers, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was less comfortable with the situation than he wanted to appear. Celeste arrived on his arm, having apparently cut short her European vacation to attend the party she couldn't afford to miss, and I had to admire the strategic intelligence that had brought her back despite the risk of being present for whatever I might have planned. She was wearing a red dress that would photograph beautifully but struck exactly the wrong note for an event that celebrated understated elegance, marking her as someone who understood Instagram aesthetics better than the subtle social codes that govern gatherings like this one. "Evelyn," Douglas said, approaching me with the confidence of someone who'd spent our entire marriage believing he could manage my behavior through the right combination of charm and authority, "you've outdone yourself. The estate has never looked more beautiful." "Thank you," I replied, accepting his kiss on both cheeks with the gracious composure that had served me well throughout countless social situations where I'd needed to maintain perfect manners while navigating treacherous emotional terrain. "I'm so glad you could both attend. It wouldn't be the same celebration without the people who've played such important roles in shaping who I've become." The subtext was unmistakable to anyone who understood the dynamics at play, but Douglas had never been particularly skilled at reading between the lines when the subject was my emotional state rather than political strategy or business negotiations. He smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd successfully navigated a potentially awkward social situation, completely missing the fact that he'd just walked into the most sophisticated trap I'd ever constructed. Gloria Whitman was positioned strategically near the bar, her trained eye cataloging every interaction and facial expression with the professional focus that had made her the most feared and respected social chronicler on the West Coast. She was discreetly recording key moments on her phone, building the archive of material that would become the definitive account of the evening's events, and I could see her beginning to understand that she was witnessing something more significant than routine social entertaining. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced as dinner service concluded and the sky painted itself in the promised shades of rose and gold, "I want to thank you all for joining me this evening to celebrate new beginnings and the importance of understanding exactly who we are beneath the roles we've been playing." The gathered guests turned their attention to me with the focused interest that comes from recognizing that something significant is about to unfold, and I felt the intoxicating rush of holding a room full of influential people in the palm of my hand. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since Douglas had humiliated me at my birthday brunch, the culmination of weeks of careful planning and strategic positioning. "Many of you have known me for decades as Douglas Munro's wife," I continued, my voice carrying across the terrace with the clarity that comes from absolute confidence in one's message, "and I've been proud to support his various endeavors throughout our marriage. But tonight, I want to share with you some insights I've gained about the nature of partnership, the importance of recognizing contributions that may not always be visible, and the fascinating ways that financial arrangements can shape personal relationships. I could see Douglas beginning to understand that this wasn't the gracious farewell speech he'd expected, his face shifting from polite attention to something approaching concern as he realized that I was moving into territory that could prove uncomfortable for him. Celeste was watching me with the sharp focus of someone who understood that her own interests might be at stake in whatever I was about to reveal. "I've prepared a little presentation," I said, gesturing toward the screen that Marco had positioned discreetly beside the terrace, a visual journey through some of the collaborative work that has defined the Monroe family's success over the past several decades. The first images were exactly what the audience expected: photographs from Douglas's political campaigns, charity events we'd hosted together, business celebrations where we'd appeared as the perfect power couple that had served as the foundation of his public image. But gradually, the presentation began to reveal details that painted a more complex picture of our partnership, showing documents with my handwriting, strategies I'd developed, connections I'd cultivated, and financial analysis I'd conducted. "As you can see," I said, my voice maintaining the warm conversational tone that made the devastating revelations feel like intimate confidences rather than public accusations, "the Monroe success story has always been a collaborative effort, though the collaboration hasn't always been acknowledged in the way that one might expect." The images shifted to more recent material, the financial documents I'd been gathering for months, showing the systematic movement of assets into entities where Douglas had believed I couldn't access them, the shell companies and offshore accounts. That revealed a pattern of financial behavior that would be of great interest to anyone concerned with transparency in business relationships. "I find it fascinating," I continued, watching Douglas's face as he began to understand the depth of knowledge I'd been hiding throughout our marriage, "how financial arrangements can reveal the true nature of relationships that may appear quite different on the surface." The screen filled with the documentation that Ingrid had compiled showing Celeste's consulting payments, the financial connections between her influencer business and Douglas's corporate entities, the careful timing that suggested a professional relationship that had been carefully disguised as a romantic connection. The audience was beginning to murmur with the kind of interest that comes from recognizing a story that will be discussed in their social circles for years to come. "For example," I said, my voice carrying just enough warmth to make the revelation feel like fascinating gossip rather than calculated destruction, "it appears that some of the relationships we've all been observing in our social circle may have had more complex financial underpinnings than we realized. Modern romance can be so sophisticated, don't you think?" Celeste's face had gone white beneath her carefully applied makeup, and I could see her calculating whether she could leave gracefully or whether departure would only confirm the implications of what I was revealing. Douglas was staring at me with something approaching awe, finally understanding that the wife he'd considered intellectually inferior had been conducting a forensic analysis of his business dealings while maintaining the perfect facade of devoted compliance. "I want to toast new beginnings," I said, raising my glass of Dom Pérignon with the elegant gesture that had become my signature at countless social gatherings, "and the importance of understanding exactly who we're dealing with in our personal and professional relationships, to truth, transparency, and the fascinating ways that financial arrangements can illuminate the real nature of human connections." The toast was echoed throughout the gathering with the automatic response that comes from years of social conditioning, but I could see the wheels turning in the minds of people who were beginning to understand that they'd just witnessed something far more significant than routine divorce drama. Gloria was discreetly live tweeting key moments to her followers, creating the real-time documentation that would ensure my version of events became the definitive narrative that survived in social memory. Douglas approached me as the evening's entertainment began, his face carefully composed but his eyes showing the combination of fury and grudging respect that comes from recognizing that one has been comprehensively outmaneuvered by someone previously considered harmless. "Evelyn," he said, his voice pitched low enough that our conversation wouldn't be overheard but carrying the edge that emerged when his political skills failed him in personal situations, "what exactly do you think you've accomplished tonight?" "I've Reminded our friends who I really am, I replied, maintaining the serene smile that had served me well throughout decades of navigating complex social situations, and I've provided them with information that might be useful in their own business and personal relationships. I thought transparency was something you valued, Douglas. He stared at me for a long moment, finally seeing the woman I'd always been beneath the careful facade of the perfect wife, understanding that he'd spent 35 years underestimating someone who had been quietly building the case for his own destruction. "You've destroyed everything," he said finally, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice despite the fury that was building behind his carefully maintained composure. "I've liberated everything," I corrected, watching as security personnel approached discreetly, not the hired staff for the party, but the kind of serious men who appear when financial irregularities require immediate attention, including myself. Detective Lang materialized beside us with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to make his presence known, his badge discreetly visible beneath his formal jacket and his expression carrying the professional neutrality that comes with years of investigating white-collar crime. "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice pitched at the perfect volume to be heard by nearby guests without causing undue alarm. "I wonder if we might have a word about some financial arrangements that have come to our attention. There are some consulting agreements and fund transfers that require clarification." Douglas's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious: shock, calculation, fury, and finally the kind of resignation that comes from recognizing that escape routes have been systematically eliminated by someone who understood the terrain better than you realized. Celeste had disappeared at some point during the conversation, her red dress last seen moving rapidly toward the parking area with the desperate speed of someone who understood that her carefully constructed social position had just evaporated in real time. Her Instagram account would be deactivated by morning, her influencer career destroyed by association with the financial scandal that was about to consume the man she'd been paid to pursue. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced as the evening wound toward its conclusion, my voice carrying across the terrace with the warmth that had made me genuinely beloved by people who were now seeing me clearly for the first time. "Thank you for joining me in celebrating new beginnings and the importance of truth in all our relationships. I hope this evening has been as illuminating for you as it has been for me." The applause was genuine and sustained, coming from people who recognized that they'd witnessed something remarkable, not just the destruction of a marriage, but the emergence of a woman who had been hiding in plain sight for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the intelligence and strength that had always been there beneath the surface. As the last guests departed and the caterers began the elegant process of restoring the estate to its normal perfection, I stood alone on the terrace where I'd spent so many evenings feeling invisible and unappreciated, watching the lights of the city spread out below me like a constellation of possibilities I was finally free to explore. Douglas Monroe had taught me that the most effective victories were the ones that didn't look like victories at all, that appeared to be natural consequences of superior intelligence and careful preparation rather than deliberate attacks designed to destroy one's opponents. Tonight, he'd learned exactly how good a student I'd been, and the lesson had cost him everything he'd believed was safely beyond my reach. The morning sun filtered through my bedroom windows with the same golden clarity that had blessed the party, but the world it illuminated had been fundamentally transformed by the events of the previous evening. I lay in bed for a few extra moments, savoring the profound silence that comes after storms have passed and new landscapes have emerged from the wreckage of what came before, listening to the distant sounds of Marco's cleanup crew restoring the estate to its everyday elegance. My phone was buzzing with notifications, but I ignored them in favor of the coffee that Maria brought with her customary efficiency, her weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice, served with the kind of style that would be remembered and discussed for decades. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, setting the silver tray beside my bed with the reverence reserved for moments of historical significance, "the newspapers have arrived." The headlines were everything I could have hoped for and more. Gloria Whitman's column, which had been posted online at midnight and rushed into the morning edition of the city's most influential paper, was a masterpiece of social journalism that managed to convey both the elegance of the evening and the devastating nature of the revelations I'd orchestrated. "The Renaissance of Evelyn Monroe," read the main headline, with a subheading that perfectly captured the evening's significance. How the city's most underestimated woman threw the party of the decade while exposing financial fraud in elite social circles. The accompanying photographs, taken by the society photographer I'd hired specifically for the purpose, showed me at my most radiant, confident, elegant, clearly in command of both the evening and my own destiny. The images of Douglas being led away for questioning by Detective Lang were discreetly positioned but unmistakably present, creating a visual narrative that would become the definitive record of his spectacular fall from grace. Douglas Monroe, the former mayor and real estate mogul whose political career was built on promises of transparency and ethical governance, found himself facing federal investigation last night following revelations that emerged during what was ostensibly a divorce celebration thrown by his soon-to-be former wife, Gloria had written. Her prose carrying the perfect balance of factual reporting and devastating social commentary that had made her reputation. The story continued with details that could have come only from the documentation I'd provided, describing the shell companies and offshore accounts that Douglas had used to hide assets, the consulting payments to Celeste that suggested their relationship had been more business arrangement than romance, and the systematic pattern of financial deception that painted a portrait of a man whose public image had been carefully constructed to hide a much more complex reality. But what pleased me most was Gloria's portrayal of my own role in the evening's events, which she'd crafted with the skill of someone who understood that the most compelling stories were those that revealed hidden depths in characters who had previously been dismissed as supporting players. Evelyn Monroe moved through the evening with the grace of someone who had finally stepped into her proper role, she had written, revealing herself to be not the devoted but passive wife that society had believed her to be, but rather a sophisticated strategist who had been quietly documenting her husband's business practices while building her own network of relationships and resources. The phone began ringing before I'd finished reading the article, and I answered to find Harry's voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a carefully planned campaign achieve total victory. "Evelyn," she said, and I could hear her smiling through the connection. "I have to hand it to you, that was the most elegant destruction of a powerful man that I've ever witnessed, and I've been in the revenge business for 30 years. "It wasn't destruction," I replied, settling back against my pillows with the contentment that comes from a job well done. "It was clarification. Douglas spent our entire marriage teaching me that the truth has a way of emerging when people are paying attention, and last night I simply made sure that the right people were paying attention at exactly the right moment." Harry laughed with genuine delight, the sound of someone who appreciated artistry in whatever form it took. "The FBI raided his offices this morning," she said, "and apparently Celeste has retained criminal defense counsel. Your little slideshow presentation provided them with enough evidence to open investigations that are going to keep both of them busy for the foreseeable future." I felt a surge of satisfaction that was tempered by the knowledge that my real work was just beginning. The party had been designed to establish my independence and demonstrate my capabilities, but it had also served as the opening move in whatever career I decided to pursue now that I was free to be the person I'd always been beneath the facade of the perfect wife. "There's something else," Harry continued, her voice taking on the tone that indicated she was transitioning from friend to professional advisor. "Miles Carter called this morning. Apparently, several people from last night's guest list have contacted him about your availability for consulting work. It seems that your presentation of Douglas's financial arrangements impressed quite a few people who have their own complex business relationships that might benefit from the kind of analysis you've proven yourself capable of conducting." The possibility was intriguing. The prospect of using the skills I'd developed during my marriage to help other people navigate the treacherous waters of wealth management and relationship dynamics that defined life among the social elite. I had spent decades learning to read people and situations with surgical precision, understanding the subtle codes that governed behavior in circles where image was everything and secrets were currency. "What kind of consulting work?" I asked, already beginning to envision the possibilities that were opening before me like doors in a house I'd never been allowed to explore. "Financial forensics," Harry replied, "relationship analysis, strategic planning for people who need to understand exactly what they're dealing with in their personal and professional lives. Essentially, you'd be doing for other people what you spent the last 5 years doing for yourself, uncovering truth that's been carefully hidden and helping clients position themselves strategically based on that information." The idea was perfect. a natural evolution of the skills I'd developed while documenting Douglas's deceptions and planning my own carefully orchestrated emergence from his shadow. I had proven myself capable of conducting sophisticated investigations while maintaining absolute discretion, of analyzing complex financial relationships while understanding the human dynamics that drove them, of planning and executing strategies that achieved maximum impact with minimal obvious effort. I'm interested, I said, feeling the excitement that comes from recognizing a future that would allow me to be fully myself while helping other people who found themselves in situations similar to the one I'd just escaped. Set up a meeting. The rest of the morning brought a steady stream of phone calls and messages, some from friends expressing amazement at the evening I'd orchestrated, others from business associates who were beginning to understand that Evelyn Monroe might be someone worth knowing independently of her connection to Douglas. Each conversation reinforced my growing sense that the party had achieved exactly what I'd intended, not just the destruction of Douglas's carefully constructed image, but the establishment of my own identity as someone who commanded respect and attention in her own right. Sasha arrived at noon, her face glowing with the kind of pride that comes from watching someone you love step fully into their power. She found me in my office, where I'd been reviewing the business proposals that had somehow materialized overnight, as if the entire city had been waiting for Evelyn Monroe to become available for hire. "Mom," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the comfortable authority that our relationship had developed over the past few weeks, "I have something to show you." She pulled out her laptop and opened a blog post she'd written and published that morning, titled "Why I'm Proud to Be Evelyn Monroe's Daughter." The piece was beautifully written, combining personal anecdotes about my intelligence and strength with broader observations about the ways that society systematically undervalues women's contributions to their family's success. I wanted people to understand that what they saw last night wasn't some kind of miraculous transformation, she had written, but rather the emergence of a woman who had always been remarkable, but had chosen to express that remarkableness through supporting other people's ambitions rather than pursuing her own. The post was going viral, shared thousands of times by people who recognized the truth of what Sasha was describing and appreciated her eloquent defense of my choices and capabilities. Comments were pouring in from women who had found themselves in similar situations, who had subordinated their own talents to their husbands' careers and were inspired by my example of reclaiming independent identity. "Sasha," I said, reading through the responses that were still accumulating in real time, "this is beautiful and brave. Thank you for understanding what last night was really about. It was about you becoming who you've always been," she replied, reaching across the desk to squeeze my hand with the affection that had sustained me through the darkest moments of planning my emergence from Douglas's shadow, and showing everyone else that they'd been idiots for not seeing it before. James appeared in my office doorway as we were finishing our conversation, his expression carrying the complexity of someone who was trying to reconcile the mother he'd always known with the woman who had orchestrated Douglas's spectacular downfall. At 35, he had inherited Douglas's natural charm but also his tendency toward emotional blindness, and I could see him struggling to understand how I'd managed to outmaneuver his father so completely while appearing to be nothing more than the elegant supporting actress he'd always believed me to be. "Mom," he said, settling into the third chair in my office with the careful positioning of someone who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome, "I owe you an apology." "Several apologies, actually. For what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what had prompted this moment of conscience. "For underestimating you," he replied, his voice carrying genuine regret. "For assuming that Dad's version of events was accurate without bothering to ask for your perspective. For helping him with financial arrangements that I now realize were designed to cheat you out of assets you'd helped accumulate over 35 years of marriage." It was more self-awareness than James had typically displayed, and I recognized the influence of watching his father being led away for questioning while his mother emerged as the evening's undisputed victor. Sometimes the most effective education comes from witnessing the consequences of assumptions that prove to be catastrophically wrong. "James," I said, looking at my son with the love that had never wavered despite the disappointments and misunderstandings that had marked our relationship, "you're your father's son, which means you inherited his intelligence and charm along with his blind spots. What matters now is what you do with the understanding you've gained." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion James and I had ever had, covering not just the events of the previous evening but the broader patterns of behavior that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. He was beginning to understand that his automatic loyalty to Douglas had prevented him from seeing the woman who had actually been the strategic architect of much of the Monroe family's success, and I could see him recalibrating his understanding of both his parents and himself. As the afternoon wore on and the immediate excitement of the previous evening began to settle into something more sustainable, I found myself feeling a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with finally being seen clearly by the people who mattered most to me. The party had been spectacularly successful, but its real value lay not in Douglas's destruction but in my own emergence as someone who commanded respect and attention independent of any relationship or supporting role. Miles Carter called as the day was winding toward evening, his voice carrying the professional satisfaction of someone who had helped orchestrate a complex financial operation that had achieved all of its objectives while maintaining perfect legal and ethical standards. "Evelyn," he said, "I have a proposition for you, something that might interest you as you consider what comes next in your newly independent life." "Tell me," I replied, settling into my office chair with the anticipation of someone who was ready to hear about possibilities she'd never previously been allowed to imagine. "I'm starting a new division of my wealth management firm," he said, "specifically focused on helping people navigate complex relationship and financial situations that require both analytical intelligence and sophisticated understanding of human dynamics. I think you'd be perfect as the founding partner." The offer was everything I could have hoped for and more, the opportunity to use my skills professionally while building something entirely my own, working with people who found themselves in situations similar to the one I'd just escaped, helping them understand their options and position themselves strategically for whatever came next. "I'm very interested," I said, feeling the future opening before me like sunrise after a long night of uncertainty. "When can we discuss the details?" "Tomorrow morning," Miles replied, "assuming you're ready to start building the next chapter of your life immediately." I was ready, more than ready. For the first time in 35 years, I was free to be entirely myself, and the world was waiting to discover exactly what Evelyn Monroe was capable of accomplishing when she stopped pretending to be less than she was. The sunrise breakfast was held 6 weeks later, on a morning that carried the particular clarity that comes after storms have passed and new landscapes have emerged from the wreckage of what came before. I'd chosen the garden terrace where Douglas had served me divorce papers, transforming the space where I'd experienced my most profound humiliation into the setting for a celebration of everything I'd become since stepping out of his shadow. The table was set for 8 with the Limoges china that had been my grandmother's, passed down through generations of women who'd understood that true elegance lay not in ostentation but in the careful attention to details that separated special occasions from ordinary moments. Fresh peonies from my own garden filled crystal vases that caught the morning light like captured rainbows, and the silver coffee service gleamed with the warm patina that comes only from decades of careful use and loving maintenance. Harry arrived first, as I'd known she would, carrying a bottle of champagne that she'd opened despite the early hour and wearing the kind of flowing dress that made her look like a bohemian goddess celebrating the victory of intelligence over brute force. "Evelyn," she said, embracing me with the affection of someone who had watched me transform from devastated wife to independent woman of power and influence, "you look absolutely radiant." I did feel radiant, lighter and more energetic than I'd been in years, as if discarding Douglas's version of who I was supposed to be had freed me to inhabit my own body with complete comfort for the first time since my 20s. The Monroe Foundation for Women in Strategy and Design was officially launching next month, housed in offices I'd leased in the same building where Miles and I had started our consulting partnership. And I was finally doing work that used every aspect of my intelligence and experience. Sasha and Ingrid arrived together, their relationship having deepened as they'd worked with me to document the financial irregularities that had led to Douglas's plea agreement and subsequent disappearance from public life. Sasha was glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had watched her mother claim her proper place in the world, while Ingrid carried herself with the confidence that comes from being recognized as an expert in the kind of digital forensics that were becoming increasingly valuable in complex financial investigations. Marco appeared with his characteristic dramatic flair, carrying a pastry box from the French bakery that had become his signature touch for intimate gatherings, and wearing the kind of perfectly tailored casual clothes that somehow managed to be both comfortable and museum-worthy. The party planning business we'd started together was already booked solid through the next year, with waiting lists of clients who wanted the kind of sophisticated events that told stories rather than simply displaying wealth. "Darling," he said, air kissing my cheeks with the theatrical affection that had made him genuinely beloved by clients who appreciated his ability to transform their dreams into reality. "This morning is absolutely perfect. I can see why you chose this setting for your celebration of new beginnings." Miles arrived last, carrying the business proposal we'd been refining for weeks, his understated elegance providing the perfect counterpoint to Marco's more flamboyant style. Our consulting partnership had exceeded every expectation I'd allowed myself to imagine, with clients ranging from women navigating complex divorces to business owners trying to understand the true nature of their partnerships, all of whom benefited from the combination of his financial expertise and my ability to read the human dynamics that drove economic relationships. "Good morning, Evelyn," he said, settling into the chair beside mine with the comfortable familiarity that had developed between us over weeks of working together on cases that required both analytical intelligence and sophisticated understanding of social dynamics. "I brought the final numbers for the foundation's endowment. I think you'll be pleased with how the investments have performed." As we settled around the table that had been set with the same attention to detail I'd once devoted to supporting Douglas's ambitions, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from being surrounded by people who saw me clearly and appreciated both my capabilities and my character. These were the relationships I'd chosen rather than inherited, the family I'd built rather than simply accepted, and their presence transformed the space where I'd once felt invisible into the center of a universe I'd created entirely according to my own vision. "I want to thank you all," I said, raising my champagne glass with the gesture that had become my signature at countless social gatherings over the years, "for helping me become the person I was always meant to be and for proving that the best revenge is the kind that doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like success, independence, and the natural consequences of finally allowing yourself to be seen clearly." Harry stood to offer her own toast, her voice carrying the warmth that had sustained me through the darkest moments of planning my emergence from Douglas's shadow. "To Evelyn Monroe," she said, "who taught us all that the most dangerous women are the ones who appear harmless while quietly building empires of their own design." The laughter that followed was genuine and joyful, the sound of people who had witnessed something remarkable and were proud to have played supporting roles in a story that would be remembered and retold for decades. Each person at the table had contributed to my transformation in ways that had been essential to its success, and I felt the profound gratitude that comes from understanding exactly how much courage it takes to help someone else become their truest self. Sasha pulled out her phone to show us the latest coverage of the Foundation's upcoming launch, including a feature article in the business section that described me as one of the city's most influential behind-the-scenes power brokers, finally stepping into the spotlight she's always deserved. The photograph they'd used showed me in my office, surrounded by the awards and recognition I'd received since establishing my independence, looking like someone who had always been exactly where she belonged. "Mom," she said, scrolling through the comments that were still accumulating on the article's website, "people are calling you an inspiration. There are women sharing their own stories about hidden contributions and undervalued intelligence, saying that watching you claim your proper place has given them courage to demand recognition for their own capabilities." It was more than I'd dared to hope for when I'd first begun planning my emergence from Douglas's shadow, the understanding that my personal transformation might serve as a template for other women who found themselves in similar situations. The Foundation's mission was precisely that, helping women develop the strategic and design thinking skills that would allow them to build independent careers and claim recognition for contributions that had previously been invisible. Marco was describing the launch party we'd planned for the Foundation's official opening, an event that would combine the sophisticated elegance I'd become known for with the kind of substance that established serious organizations rather than simply generating social coverage. "It's going to be spectacular," he said, his eyes lighting with the enthusiasm of an artist who had found his perfect canvas, but spectacular in the way that changes how people think about philanthropy and women's professional development rather than just providing beautiful photographs. Miles was reviewing the financial projections that showed the foundation would be self-sustaining within 3 years, with an endowment large enough to provide scholarships and consulting services for women who were ready to step into their own power but needed guidance in developing the skills and strategies that would make their transformation sustainable. "You've created something that will outlast all of us," he said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice as he contemplated the scope of what I'd built in just a few months of independent work. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it to see Harry's assistant forwarding a news item that had appeared in the morning's legal brief section. Douglas had taken a plea agreement that would allow him to serve his sentence in a minimum security facility while paying substantial fines and agreeing to permanent exclusion from several industries where his financial irregularities had created regulatory concerns. Celeste had disappeared entirely from public view, her social media accounts deleted, and her influencer career effectively ended by association with the scandal that had consumed the man she'd been paid to pursue. I showed the message to the others, watching their faces as they absorbed the news that marked the final chapter of the story that had begun with divorce papers served at a birthday brunch. There was satisfaction in knowing that Douglas's attempt to discard me had resulted in his own comprehensive destruction, but the real victory lay not in his downfall but in my own rise to a position where his opinion of me was completely irrelevant to my success or happiness. "Justice," Harry said simply, raising her glass in a final toast to the poetic symmetry of seeing someone's worst impulses become the instrument of their own destruction. As the morning wound toward its gentle conclusion and my guests began to prepare for their departures, I walked through the gardens that had been transformed from the backdrop of my humiliation into the setting for celebrating everything I'd accomplished since refusing to accept Douglas's version of who I was supposed to be. The estate felt different now, no longer a prison disguised as paradise but simply a beautiful home where I was free to live according to my own preferences and priorities. The nameplate beside the front gate had been changed the previous week, replacing the ornate Monroe estate with simple lettering that read "The Monroe Foundation for Women in Strategy and Design." It was a small detail that carried enormous symbolic weight, marking the transformation of a space that had been dedicated to maintaining Douglas's image into something that would help other women develop their own independent identities and capabilities. I stood at the window of my office, looking out at the view that had once represented everything I couldn't have and now embodied everything I'd chosen to create, feeling the profound contentment that comes from finally inhabiting a life that matches your actual capabilities and desires rather than someone else's expectations of what you should want. The woman who had been served divorce papers at her own birthday party was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect and attention in her own right, who built businesses and changed lives and created beauty that served purposes beyond mere decoration. Douglas Monroe had taught me that the most effective victories were the ones that didn't look like victories at all, and in destroying his own carefully constructed image while trying to discard me, he had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for me to become exactly who I was always meant to be. The sun was higher now, warming the gardens where I would host another gathering next month to celebrate the foundation's launch, and I could already envision the conversations that would take place around tables set with the same attention to detail that had marked this morning's perfect breakfast. There would be women who were ready to step into their own power, advisors who understood the complexity of transformation, and supporters who appreciated the difference between charity and investment in human potential. I had spent 35 years learning to read people and situations with surgical precision, understanding the subtle codes that governed behavior in circles where image was everything and secrets were currency, developing the skills that had allowed me to outmaneuver Douglas so completely that he never understood what was happening, until it was far too late to prevent his own destruction. Now those same skills would serve a different purpose, helping other women navigate the treacherous waters of claiming their own authority while building the kind of support systems that made independence sustainable rather than simply dramatic. The Monroe Foundation would become the legacy I chose to leave rather than the one that had been imposed upon me, and every woman who walked through our doors would benefit from the education I'd received in the art of elegant revenge. I smiled as I turned away from the window, ready to begin another day of work that used every aspect of my intelligence and experience in service of purposes I'd chosen rather than inherited. The breakfast had been perfect, exactly the kind of intimate celebration that marked genuine transformation rather than mere social positioning. And the people who had shared it with me understood that they'd witnessed not an ending, but a beginning. Evelyn Monroe was finally home, in the life she'd built according to her own vision, surrounded by beauty she'd created in work that mattered and relationships that nourished rather than diminished her spirit. And if that wasn't the most elegant revenge of all, it was certainly the most satisfying. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.